A few years ago, I encountered a curious collection of videos as I was searching for images that could speak to the subject of financial crises. At that time, I had been developing a body of work around financial capitalism and became preoccupied with the question of how you can even observe a financial crisis. Unlike other types of events to which we assign the signifier crisis, a financial crisis appears from the outset to resist observation altogether. This much is suggested by the indices and graphs showing plunging stock prices that fill the news channels at the outbreak of each crisis, as if in the absence of a site to which one could point the camera, we can only represent the realm of mathematical abstraction. After all, by what other means can we seek to understand how an asset can lose almost all its value overnight, despite its physical properties remaining exactly the same? A crisis of visibility. As I was pondering this question, a German filmmaker friend of mine shared that back in 2014, he had gotten to know of a collection of videos that he believed could help me with my research. He said that he himself had been alerted to the existence of this collection by an American acquaintance who claimed to be an independent observer of global stock markets and small-time investor. At that time, the American had been following the stock prices of a number of Chinese companies that began appearing on the New York Stock Exchange not long after the 2008 financial crisis, when fund managers in the US were diverting their investments towards China. While he was searching for information on some of these companies, he came across a report written by a so-called due diligence-based investment company that investigates public companies for fraud while placing bets on the market against companies deemed to be fraudulent by short-selling their stocks. The report claimed that widespread fraud was happening with many Chinese companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and provided what it called indisputable evidence that they were reporting revenue figures at least 10 times their actual value. This evidence came in the form of surveillance footage that the authors had collected over the course of an entire year by hiring investigators in China to illegally install cameras in front of the gates of the factories run by these companies. The idea was that by counting the numbers of workers and vehicles seen leaving the factory in these videos, one would be able to tell whether the company was indeed worth the figures it reported. After doing some research of my own, I managed to find some of these videos online. In each of these videos, a time-lapse recording purportedly shows a full day of activity at the gate of a particular factory in China. As recounted by my German filmmaker friend, some of the companies that appeared in these videos were eventually investigated for fraud and delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. There were even fears at that time that the scale of fraud and corruption being exposed could lead to the next financial crisis, this time originating in China. While such fears eventually did not materialize, I could not help but be troubled by what this haunting image of an empty Chinese factory could possibly say about the world in which we live. In fact, the moment I first laid my eyes upon one of these videos, I had the uncanniest experience of seeing over a century of industrial modernity flash across my mind. If these videos had originally been made to expose the hollowness of the so-called Chinese economic miracle, it appears that there is yet another story to be told behind these factory gates. A story of industry at a global scale that is at the same time a story of cinema. A story that locates the origin of cinema at the height of industrial modernity, thus forever tethering one to the other, even in the moments when they appear to move apart from each other. A story of industry told through different genres of factory films, beginning with the genre that shows workers leaving the factory. In the 1895 film Workers Leaving the Factory, often referred to as the first motion picture ever made, workers employed at a factory owned by the Lumière family are rushing out of the gate after a day's work. The filmmakers, the Lumière brothers, had likely decided upon shooting this scene, knowing that there was nothing more suitable for demonstrating cinema's capacity for capturing movement than workers being freed from the disciplinary confines of the factory. As another German filmmaker once speculated, the workers must have first been assembled behind the gate to await their cue to begin moving. This spatial compression, according to Harun Farokhi, reflects the industrial order that synchronizes the lives of the workers inside the factory. If so, the moment of their release from the factory can be said to at once index the beginning of their free time and the freeing of the still image into cinematic movement. Given that the film was made to demonstrate the possibility of making images move, one could even say that movement here is necessarily experienced in its temporal plenitude, emancipating the viewer from the empty, homogeneous time of capitalist modernity. In the decades to come, this pure experience of movement was quickly displaced by narrative as the key attraction of cinema. Yet, the image of workers pouring out of the factory gate continues to stand as a sign for freedom. As seen in classical Hollywood cinema, the camera repeatedly returns to the factory gate to show workers leaving the factory, often even moving in step with the workers as they walk away. Here, what's more important than the cinematic quality of the image is the fact that the workers are leaving behind the world of labor and production to enter the world of leisure and consumption. For it is only by first shedding their class identity as workers that they can resume their private lives as individuals whose stories can then be told. One could say that the factory gate exists precisely to maintain the separation of these two worlds, thus consigning cinema to begin from the space outside the factory, never to enter and see what exactly happens within. It is worth noting that in this genre of factory films, the workers are usually leaving the factory to meet a romantic partner or potential suitor of the opposite sex. This heterosexual magnetism is what extracts the individual worker from the amorphous mass of bodies that temporarily forms at the gate as the workers exit the factory at the same time. In some of these films, romance even becomes a way for the worker of the increasingly feminized workforce of the early 20th century to escape her class condition by marrying into the bourgeoisie, thus ensuring that the transient gathering of labor at the factory gate will not extend into any kind of class solidarity. The exception to this rule is when workers are leaving the factory to go on a strike, as the tramp played by Charlie Chaplin does in Modern Times, albeit not exactly by his own will. Indeed, the entire film plays out as a process in which he continually enters and leaves the factory, almost always due to circumstances that are not of his own making. At the strike, he even hits a police officer by accident, and as a result is arrested and sent to the disciplinary space after which the factory was modeled, the prison. But sometimes, the mass of bodies outside the factory can prove too enormous to be contained by force, as seen in films set during the Depression. In these films, the workers have left the factory to go on a march, not because they're on strike, but because they have been laid off and are unable to find new employment. In the British film Love on the Dole, the march that takes place at the climax is based on an actual event organized by the communist-led National Unemployed Workers Movement to protest the reductions in unemployment benefits. Here, no amount of heterosexual attraction to the film's heroine can prevent her socialist activist partner from going to the march, where he unfortunately meets his tragic end. But perhaps the greater tragedy is that due to multiple delays, the film was released only in 1941, when the wartime conditions meant that there was no lack of employment, resulting in the film finding a lukewarm reception among a public that were focused on a very different set of concerns. With the conclusion of the war, the economic boom that followed would continue to reabsorb the masses back into the factory, back into the world of industrial production, hidden from the camera by the factory gate. Or if the workers are to be seen at all, they can only be glimpsed at the threshold of visibility, marked by the gate where labor emerges into its own dissipation. However, returning to the view captured by the surveillance cameras pointed at the Chinese factory, I found myself confronted by a slightly different scene. The camera here has been elevated, allowing us to look further into the space behind the gate. As if after trying all these years, cinema has finally managed to penetrate the border and capture the world of labor and production, though not by very much. Like the original genre of the factory film, the investigators here appear to proceed from the premise that the size of a factory's industrial output is reflected in the number of workers that pass through its gates. Yet, I cannot help but be troubled by just how little workers can be seen in these videos. How is it possible for a factory of that size to have only such a handful of workers? After confirming with my German filmmaker friend that there was only one exit from which the workers could leave the factory, I started to consider a second possibility, that the workers had in fact been inside the factory all this time, which is to say that they never ever leave the factory. The truth is that the history of cinema also provides us with no lack of films in which workers appear to spend all their time within the factory. Unfortunately, we don't really make such films anymore today. So to address my doubts, I could only turn to a genre of cinema that emerged about a quarter century after the Lumières made the first film. A genre made in a time when the dreams of industrial modernity were powered by the flames of revolution. A genre that I call Workers Never Leaving the Socialist Factory. In this genre, workers are often first seen leaving a factory, specifically a capitalist factory, from which they have walked out en masse in a general strike. With the success of the revolution, they return to the factory, this time as its rightful owners, in hope that they will never have to walk out again. This is why, unlike in the first genre of factory films, here it is precisely towards the interior of the factory that the camera is irresistibly drawn. As seen in the films produced during the early years of the Soviet Union, filling the screen are images of intense physical labor that would have been hidden from the camera by a gate in the capitalist factory. Unlike in a capitalist mode of production, labor here is performed not through standardized rhythms resulting from the disciplining of the individual body, but in frenetic rushes or storms executed by collectives of workers that send their bodies into a state of shock. Such was the premise of shock work promulgated by the Stalinist state system following the launch of the first 5-year plan in 1929, that sought to speed up the socialist reconstruction of the economy by increasing worker productivity. Rejecting the pegging of wages to productivity that incentivized workers in the capitalist factory, the Soviet system instead turned towards forms of socialist competition that valorized the overexertion of the worker's body as a means of continually surpassing one's human limitations. Despite the fact that the promotion of shock work resulted in labor conditions that were more brutal and arduous than those under capitalism. The authorities sought to refigure the bodily pain experienced by the workers as a form of collective emancipation from the machines that dictated their movements within the capitalist factory. Here, the workers fulfilled their obligations over and above their assigned quotas, not by following the norms fixed by a set of rationalized industrial practices, but by actively breaking these norms, often by compensating the limitations of their outmoded technology with their capacity to withstand the exhaustion of their bodies. As Susan Buck-Morss suggests, underlying this perverse imaginary of the worker's body was the idea that the workers, by at once attacking their own bodies and bearing the brunt of their attack, would produce the shock of modernity rather than passively receive its effects. This transforms the exhaustion of their bodies from a condition of subjugation into that which enables historical change, bringing them closer to the dream of a communist future. If in classical Hollywood cinema, workers have to first leave the factory before the narrative of their lives as private individuals can unfold, here the story begins as they enter the factory to dissolve their sense of individuality altogether. The rush of bodies leaving the factory is replaced by the rushes of hands and feet attacking and being attacked by their machines, with the workers transformed into a kind of man-machine, fusing living labor with motorized speed. As a kind of sublation of the capitalist mode of production that subordinates human labor to the ceaseless and repetitive motions of the machine, labor here becomes the means of pushing the body beyond its limits so that it becomes at once more than a machine and more than human. That is, superhuman. It is on this basis that we should understand the rapid cuts of early Soviet montage, not for its machine-like acceleration, but for its visceral disintegration of the workers' bodies into a flurry of shocking effects, from which emerges an amalgamation that is more than the sum of its parts, namely, the collective consciousness of the socialist state. So, after examining early Soviet factory films, I realized that I still couldn't fully comprehend what exactly is happening in this view of the factory gate in China. Even if the workers were indeed inside the factory all this time, there was no guarantee that they were all working themselves to exhaustion like their Soviet counterparts of an earlier time. After sharing my dilemma with my German filmmaker friend, I could see that he was almost taken aback to know that I had been spending all my time watching all these early Soviet films. If anything, he said, I should be looking into Chinese cinema. Admittedly, I was initially a little offended that a German had suggested that my cinematic references were too Eurocentric. But soon I came to see his point. Indeed, after having another look at the surveillance footage with his remark in mind, I recalled another genre of films showing workers inside the factory that emerged a couple of decades after the peak of early Soviet cinema. A genre that would by the 1950s even come to define itself explicitly against the factory films made under the Soviet system. A genre that I can only call Workers Never Leaving the Chinese Socialist Factory.
今天我看到黄宝妹另外的一面，我从来没见她这样激动过。今天我也体会到黄宝妹常谈起的，在她的工作遇到困难的时候，有人总是在讲啊，机器老爷，老爷机器，可是我们人不老爷。 人是决定一切的。现在在搞革命，假如我们不懂机器，不掌握技术，那还搞什么技术革命呢？对呀，不要把问题看得太容易。
学会检修机器这工作不简单。我们培养个保全工要多少年呢？
没什么神秘的，你别把问题看得太复杂了，好吧？
你可以做到，这个我完全相信。你是全国劳动模范。
哎呀，劳动模范也是人呢，又不是生下来就是劳动模范了。劳动模范能做到的事，只要我们肯做，为什么做不到啊？是啊，学习好电秀工作法的时候，大家都说做不到，现在不是每个人都做到了？是啊，现在不过修理机器，我们女工的力气是比较小哎。这个也要有窍门呢，光凭力气是不行的。难道保全部的女工力气都是大的？我到现在还是搞不通，宝妹提出我们女工自己修理机器，是不是有这个必要？因为工作总是有分工的，分工也要看情况啊。分工是要的，但是分工过细以后是会降低我们工人技术水平的。我觉得没什么可以争论的。问题很简单，车子出了毛病，是消极的等待呢，还是主动去解决它？对啊。
我还是这句话，宝妹自己可以做到。不过我认为要拿到群众中去推广是有问题的。
你指的哪个群众啊？你指的群众是谁？那还不一样的。哎，大家等一等，让他讲，你讲。我不懂技术，但是对于挡车工人提出自己修理机器，这是纺织工人当中从来没有的事情。对于这种大胆革新的精神，我们是应该支持的。是啊，我们应该支持的。大家一个一个的发言，我们有不同的意见，还可以展开充分的辩论。
In 1958, fears that the ongoing de-Stalinization campaign in the Soviet Union would threaten Mao's legitimacy within China prompted the launch of the Great Leap Forward, a far-reaching and ultimately devastating experiment that sought to de-link the country's economy from the Soviet system. Anticipating the withdrawal of Soviet aid and technological transfer, the Communist Party turned to mass mobilization as a solution for spurring productivity and innovation under austerity conditions. Within the film industry, such strategies resulted in many productions taking the form of docudramas, a genre favored by Premier Zhou Enlai for its faster turnover rates, lower budgets, and collective scripting process. Among the docudramas produced during that year was Huang Baomei, based on the story of the real-life model worker who also plays herself as the titular protagonist. In one of the film's pivotal scenes, the machine operators of a cotton mill, all played by actual workers from the Shanghai factory where the film is set, spar with the technicians and party carders overseeing the mill on the issue of whether machine operators should be allowed to repair their machines by themselves. At the heart of the debate is the relationship between labor and technology. Is it man who masters technology, or technology that masters man? Such an extended sequence featuring workers engaging in ideological debate was a recurring motif of Chinese socialist cinema towards the 50s. In contrast to their counterparts in early Soviet cinema, who were often depicted working furiously at their machines in a fetishistic fusion of labor and technology. Here, the workers are more likely seen having meetings where they can never seem to stop talking about their machines. But as much as the promotion of workers' self-organization as seen in these films can be attributed to the economic exigencies that resulted from the Sino-Soviet split, this particular valorization of speech over physical labor is better explained as a Chinese variation of socialist competition with deep ideological roots in the party's experiences in peasant mobilization. As N. Anangos explains, in order to render legible Marxian concepts of class and exploitation to the country's mostly agrarian population, the communists drew upon age-old oral traditions within the Chinese countryside that allowed the peasantry to reinterpret the party's call to revolution through the interpersonal relations of village life. Specifically, the public venting of injured feelings, usually of aggrieved wives against their husbands, was a pervasive method of seeking justice among fellow villagers that was given a revolutionary twist when this performance of bitterness came to be redirected towards those identified by the party leaders as class enemies. With the divergence of the Chinese socialist system from the Soviet model in the 1950s, along with the party's assessment that the exploitation of labor by Soviet state enterprises had turned the socialist command system into state capitalism, it was therefore only natural that orality returned as the basis for the ideological re-education that had to take place to prevent China from going down the same path. Accordingly, where the hierarchy of state managers over manual workers had led to the bureaucratization of the Soviet enterprise system, Chinese socialism sought to break down the distinction between intellectual and manual labor by transforming the worker into the speaking subject of history, substituting orality for the toiling body as the condition for revolutionary change. If in early Soviet cinema, workers exert their bodies to the point where the cinematic image itself appears to explode, in the films produced during the Cultural Revolution, workers are more likely to suspend all physical labor so that they can fire an endless succession of revolutionary slogans at a manager accused of having abandoned the masses. Here, the revolution takes place whenever and wherever the worker speaks. In fact, it is usually beyond the factory gate that the worker comes up with some brilliant idea, often after having stared longingly at a portrait of Mao, the sheer ubiquity of which indexes the revolution's spatial boundlessness. This is also why, in this genre of factory films, the factory gate is always wide open, with the workers seen moving in and out of it at any time of the day. For the gate here designates not a border dividing one world from another, but merely one corridor among many within the expanded interior of the Chinese socialist factory. At this point, it was becoming clearer to me what exactly I was pursuing by trying to look behind the gate in these videos. Perhaps it really did not matter how many workers were in the factory, or whether the workers in the factory were all busy working or just talking among themselves. Instead, what's important to the story here is how after over a century of cinema, the camera has somehow returned to the very same space with which it began. And to continue telling this story, there was yet another genre of factory films I had to consider. A genre that emerged around the 1980s, comprising films where workers are talking much less, doing a bit more work, and would probably be working even more if not for the fact that they were facing a rather existential crisis. The workers may or may not be leaving the Chinese factory. With the launch of China's reform and opening up agenda in 1978, the untethering of economic development from long-standing ideological concerns quickly transformed many of the country's major coastal cities in the image of the emerging market economy. Within a few years, the market economy gained official recognition with the term planned commodity economy proposed by the central government in 1984, which referred to a system where central planning is retained over key sectors of the economy, while allowing exchanges based on market signals in other sectors. In Red Skirt Popular in the Street, released in the same year, we see textile workers leaving the factory to become consumers of the commodities produced from their own alienated labor. The film can even be regarded as an advertisement for the fashion trends that had swept the country as it was opening up to the global market. In fact, it was around the same period that General Secretary Hu Yaobang instructed party officials in Shenzhen to wear Western suits to secure the confidence of international investors, a move which immediately made the sartorial choice popular across the streets of China. However, or the factories located beyond the booming coastal regions. The turn towards the market economy often also entailed getting workers to leave the social security that they had enjoyed under the state-owned enterprise system. This became especially prevalent towards the 90s, as competition from private enterprises began exposing the inefficiencies of the state-owned sector and forced state-owned enterprises to make the choice of either restructuring to become more responsive to market signals or to face bankruptcy or privatization. And once again, this daunting process of systemic change would be realized through the power of speech. However, now it is not the workers, but the manager who speaks.
过去都怪我们没把工作做好，伤了你们的心。可如今中央下了决心，我们也下了决心，为什么居然就这么难？使我感到伤心的是，有很多人，包括我的老战友，都不理解我。直到10分钟前还对我唠叨说：“你会没有退路的。”没有退路并不是坏事。当初打仗那年月，为什么人人拼命？就是因为没有退路，不革命就没法子活嘛。现在可怕的是，人人都有了退路。工人有工人的退路，少说几句吧，得罪了领导，以后评工资要吃亏的。厂长有厂长的退路，当出头的船子是要倒霉的，随大流吧。有的局长、部长退路就更多了，大笔一挥，扔掉国家好几个亿，却轻轻地说一句为我们付学费吧。有的这里混不下去，换个地方照样当他的局长、部长，都坐在那里等着。最好中央哪天拿出一个神奇的法宝来，一下子把中国送进4个现代化。而他们自己呢，却完全不想负任何的一点责任。同志们，难道你们真的看不出来吗？我们退路已经不多了。我们搞了30年，不理想。万一再搞20年还不理想，中国怎么办？没有退路了。同志们，我们只有和党同心同德，拼出一个现代化的中国来，否则我们这些人再被打倒，就不会有人再为我们平反了。有人说，中国的经济体制像一架庞大的机器，有些齿轮已经锈住了、咬死了。可只要用我们的血做润滑剂，这话已经说烂了，不时髦了，没人要听了。可无论如何，我们的血总是热的。
In the 1983 film, Blood is Always Hot, we see how the power of speech that was first forged during the revolution continued to perform its political function well into the reform era. In fact, in the speech of the factory manager making a last-ditch effort at rallying the support of workers disillusioned by the reform process, revolutionary figures of speech are even mobilized to reframe the reforms as a continuation of the revolution by other means. Significantly, the film actually opens not in the factory, but at the market, specifically at the Canton Fair in Guangzhou, the country's largest trade fair that was founded in 1957 with the express aim of accumulating foreign currency reserves to combat what the historian Xu Guangzhang calls the economic Cold War. With the launch of the reforms, the proliferation of new and more fashionable products at the fair promised the manager of the state-owned textile mill to call for a reorganization of the mill's production in line with the latest consumer trends. However, he fails to convince the party secretary in charge of the mill, who insists upon adhering to old ideological lines. After facing numerous setbacks, the exasperated manager can only appeal to the workers themselves through a public address in a dramatic final scene where the latter are portrayed as passive listeners, as if they had lost the capacity for speech that had earlier enabled their revolutionary function. Comparing China's economic system to a vast machine with rusty gears that can no longer turn, the manager exhorts the workers to use their blood as lubricants. For their blood, he adds, is always hot. Such performances of revolutionary rhetoric recur across the factory films produced amidst the structural reforms of the country's bloated state-owned sector that sought to consolidate what came to be formalized in 1992 as the socialist market economy. Remarkably, the climax of these films often sees workers gathered in a large mass around the manager just behind the factory gate, almost recalling how the workers in the Lumière factory a century ago must have also been assembled behind the gate while awaiting the filmmaker's cue for the gate to open and for them to start moving. The difference is that in these films, the cue for leaving the factory comes from the manager. Sometimes, this can even take the form of granting the workers the right to vote. As one manager explains in the 1996 film, The Brave Never Turns Back, the workers can choose either to leave the factory through the East Gate to express that they are willing to be laid off in support of the reforms, or to leave through the West Gate to dismiss the manager himself. What he doesn't say is that both gates open to the socialist market economy. But if the conclusion of these films often depict, however abruptly, the successful restructuring of a state-owned enterprise in line with the principles of the market economy, this view of a suspiciously empty Chinese factory some 30 years after the launch of the reforms seemed to suggest that the Chinese economic boom was nothing but a mirage. Curiously, for all the resemblances to scenes of deserted post-industrial rust belts in the US that became prevalent after the 2008 financial crisis, these footage were made to illustrate a narrative not of a capitalism that has exhausted its capacity for growth, but of a capitalism that has been corrupted by the predatory practices of Wall Street and the deceptions endemic to a system governed by the Communist Party. If previously under the command system, local officials had over-reported figures for political gain, resulting in catastrophic consequences for the country, here, it was the promise of individual financial reward for colluding bankers, businessmen, and their auditors that had produced the discrepancy between this view of the factory gate and the figures reported to American investors. Or at least to those still dreaming of a capitalism that works for everyone after 2008. The problem with China's turn towards the market economy is not so much that it represents a betrayal of socialist principles, but that it is an aberration of capitalism. And like the command economy that preceded it, the socialist market economy is a house of cards doomed to collapse. Perhaps it is appropriate then that these images circulated around the same time, that scenes of decrepit state-owned factories, mostly in China's northeastern region and former socialist heartland, became fodder for cinematic representation, as seen in another genre of factory films, one where workers, after having left the Chinese socialist factory, have returned to the factory, this time to be a part of an independent film production. Filmed between 1999 and 2001, the years that spanned China's negotiations to enter the World Trade Organization and its eventual accession, 铁西区 by Chinese auteur Wang Bing can be said to be a pioneer of a genre of films that sought to expose the uneven development behind the miraculous growth figures of China's post-millennial economic takeoff. The turn towards the documentary form by these independently financed films almost recalls Zhou Enlai's appeal to filmmakers to make more docudramas as a strategy for producing more under a tighter budget. However, the gritty realism espoused by these films are anything but an endorsement of the state's narrative of the prevailing socio-economic system, almost directly refuting the speech of the impassioned manager of an earlier time. The filmmakers here foreground the voices of the workers displaced by the reforms, lending them an agency that unfortunately cannot seem to resist the foreclosure of socialism as a mass political project. But in an ambivalent sign that the socialist market economy might after all succeed where its predecessor had failed, this portrayal of workers against the country's post-socialist ruins has proven to be so compelling that such films were receiving state approval and even modest commercial success by the turn of the next decade. In Jia Zhangke's 2008 film, 24 City, the workers of the state-owned 420 factory in Chengdu returned to the factory to tell the story of how the manufacturer of military aircraft engines during the Great Leap Forward will be restructured to produce consumer goods and eventually redeveloped into a luxury high-rise apartment complex known as 24 City. Remarkably, the film was partly financed by China Resources Land, the developer of 24 City, and Hong Kong-based subsidiary of the state-owned conglomerate China Resources. 2 years later, Jia Zhangke would be commissioned by the Shanghai Expo to make I Wish I Knew, a documentary that weaves the history of Shanghai together with its representation in cinema across the upheavals of the 20th century. The film marks the return of the former model worker Huang Baoming to the big screen after 50 years since playing herself on film. Her return to the cinema is in turn marked by her return to the factory where she once worked, except that now the workers are nowhere to be seen. And so it is that in returning to cinema, we likewise find ourselves returned to the factory. Specifically to the factory gate, where, as if after over a century of workers fanning out of the factory, we are seeing the last remaining stragglers walk out. However, if this is indeed a scenography of late capitalism, the subject of the camera here is certainly not the workers. Instead, what the camera is looking for is a gap between representation and reality, between the flashy figures reported on the American financial receipts and the flashy figures passing through the factory gates in China. And to look into this gap is to confront the corruption that runs between unscrupulous fund managers on Wall Street and a country whose entire system is perceived as corrupt. Yet, what does it mean for us to return to the space before the factory gate after over 100 years of cinema to seek disclosure, specifically of the so-called actual value of a factory as determined by the thing we call the market? If in the scene of workers leaving the Lumière factory, the factory gate serves to conceal the exploitation of labor that happens behind it, it seems that the very claim to disclosure made by these videos constitutes a similar act of concealment, as if the question of labor has been concealed twice over. First, by the factory gate, and second, by a discourse of anti-corruption. Here, the workers appear in order to disappear altogether, a disappearance that is ironically to be construed as a sign of visibility. That is, The less the number of workers leaving the factory, the more this otherwise inscrutable view appears to us as a scene of corruption. And as with any kind of corruption, the solution is more transparency. Specifically, transparency for the age of mobile speculative international capital, where information is only as free as it enables the investor who has never stepped foot into China, not least entered one of its factories, to see just how much there is to be made from the system. To this end, there is perhaps nothing very extraordinary about these videos. Like surveillance cameras pointed at factory gates the world over, the camera in this genre of factory films serves ultimately to safeguard the ownership of property. Except that property here refers not to the visible factory, but to the invisible flows of global capital. This is why, while most surveillance footage are recorded and never to be seen, these videos have to be experienced in their entirety. For only by doing so can we observe through the passing of time that which cannot itself be seen. A kind of durational cinema, they demand from us nothing less than time itself. Yet, for all the time that we spend looking at this view, it seems as if we have forgotten what the factory gate was originally designed to conceal.